Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 3 of our woodworking bench project. So we're going to get the legs glued together, and from there we're going to drill our holes for the pivots for our legs so that they can fold up underneath it, and we're going to put the braces across the legs, as well as we're going to put some extra 2x4s underneath so that there will be an out, so that the outside frame and then the inside will have holes through them to support the leg underneath the tabletop, and that'll be attached to the frame. So we're going to get that done, and then we're going to proceed from there and get things put together.
You may have noticed during the intro video that there were already some of the things glued that I was talking about, but the reason for that is that I forgot to do the intro video until I was about halfway through, so that's why you already see things glued together in the intro. But at the beginning point of this episode, the only thing that we had glued together was the tabletop itself. So here what I've got is the sides to the frame, and what I'm doing is I'm measuring the center so that I can put the center support in here. And you can also notice that I still have the extensions with the couplers on my pipe clamps. So we had them on for the tabletop and I just left them on, and since the only other wide thing that we have to glue together is the frame, I decided to do the frame next. And you'll see here I'm going to apply glue to the ends of the cross members that go between the sides of the frame. So I'm going to put glue on those, and then I'm going to clamp those in, and we're going to start with that. So most things that I glue together, I usually start by using the clamp in the center, but because this is hollow and it's going to be an open box, I don't want to put the center in and then not be able to get the ends in without sliding it into the end and scraping all the glue off in the process. So because of that, I decided to start on the end and then just give it a general tightening, not enough to where it's fully tight, just enough to hold it together and keep it from moving. And from there I can move my way down towards the camera, and I can put the center board in and then clamp that down a little bit, and then I've only got one on the end that I actually have to worry about scraping the glue off of. And you'll notice that I have the pipe clamps lined up with where the boards need to go, and what this will do is it'll allow me to actually set the board right on that pipe when I glue it in. So that'll also keep it from falling out if I have to pry the end apart a little bit. So that's the reason that I have the pipe clamps lined up and why I use the pipe clamps that I do. So one thing you want to make sure that you do is you want to line your clamps up with where you're clamping, otherwise it'll kind of pull it kitty corner. So that's why I'm making sure, and then once you get everything lined up straight, you can straighten the boards out as I'm doing here, and then you can actually go through and tighten the clamps down. That way those boards are straight across all of your joints, and you can make sure that they're tight. So what I'm doing right now is I'm checking the square to make sure that the box of the frame is actually square, because we don't want to have it kittywampus or crooked or clamped, anything like that. We want it to be nice and square so that when we put the tabletop on, put the legs in, that they'll actually line up with the sides correctly. So because we're gluing end grain to the long grain on the boards, you want to make sure it's good and dry before you actually pull the clamps off. So I waited I believe it's a full 24 hours just to make sure. And then we don't need the extensions on the pipe clamps anymore, so I'm pulling the extensions off, and that basically just consists of pulling the clamp off of the end, removing the extension, and then sliding the other end of the clamp back on, because we're going to do the legs next, so we don't need all that width. We only need technically about 6 inches. So the first thing I do when I'm gluing boards together like this, you may have noticed at the beginning of this clip here that I was looking at the end of the boards, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to see the directions that the rings go. And when I glue them together, I usually try to make it so it's the rings makes sort of a circle, so that if they cup, it'll usually cup in the direction of the grain. So what that'll do is that'll put some pressure on the the wood glue, and since the wood glue is stronger than the wood itself, that'll kind of keep it from actually pulling apart, and it'll also keep it from twisting. It'll be a nice solid joint. So it's just standard glue on the legs, so I'm only going to show you one, but I did all four the same way. So I got 2 clamps on the bottom and then the one on top, and then once we get those glued together and they're nice and set, then we can move on to the next step. So the next step for the project is we're going to round the ends of the legs that we just got done gluing together, and we're going to round them so that they can swivel and slide underneath the bottom of the table surface. And we want to make them nice and curved so that they're the same distance from the center of that pivot point, so that the table will still rest on top of them when they're extended. So we want them to be able to swing nice. So I got the bandsaw on the Shopsmith here. It's the same setup more or less as the jointer. So you basically set it in the end, you connect it with your power coupler, and you tighten the bandsaw down on the bottom side with the usual clamp. So I've got that in here. As you can see, this is a single width 2x4. This is basically just a test board that I was testing to make sure that it was cutting well, and that I think I have a 1/4" blade on here, but I wanted to make sure there's cutting well, there was no run or blade drift or anything like that. However, sometimes woodworking will throw you a curveball. So what I will do is I will turn the audio back on so you can experience the same thing that I experienced. So I don't know if the audio and the video actually does it justice, but that will make you crap your pants. So what happened was the bandsaw blade broke. I'm not sure if it broke at the weld, but needless to say, it was not circular anymore. So even though I wasn't planning on showing everyone how to replace a bandsaw blade on a Shopsmith bandsaw, I now have the opportunity to do so. So basically I got a slightly smaller blade here, and you can see on the side there, well, you should be able to see it anyway, but there's an Allen screw that adjusts your tension. So more or less what you do is you back that off to loosen the 2 wheels inside of the cover there, and then you can set your bandsaw blade in there, and you set it through the table. There's a little key that slides out that you can slide the blade into the table and set it up on your guide wheels. And then there you can see I'm turning the Allen wrench to adjust the tension on it to get it to a proper tension, so to speak, so that we don't have any blade drift, and that we can get a nice, clean, smooth cut. So do you see what I got in my hand there? It is a smiley-faced button. So I wanted to round the ends of our legs, and I did some looking around, and I was not able to find a compass so that I could actually go through and mark the ends of the legs so then I could run them through the bandsaw. Well, I did some more looking around, and I managed to find this button sitting up on a shelf in the garage here that was actually 3 inches in diameter. What are the odds of that? Don't ever say that ingenuity doesn't pay. So it worked perfectly. So I was able to use that on the end of the legs and trace my pattern, and from there we were able to move on and run them through the bandsaw. Alright, so we got the 4 legs rounded on the ends for the most part. We'll sand those later. But I got to thinking, and I don't think I've actually had a video that used the drill press in it. So with that, I figured I would include this. What we're going to do is we're going to move the Shopsmith into the drill press configuration. And to do that, you loosen the table pivot, and then there's a pin that it allows to use for setting the table level. So you want to pull that pin out so that it can get past the stop, and then as you can see here, you can turn your table 90 degrees vertical which when you lift the way tubes up and the headstock, that will be level for us there. So you unlock the end there and you lift that up, and then there's a set screw on the bottom that I'm going to tighten to keep that vertical and hold that in place. And then we'll fast forward through some of this configuration, and we'll move the camera so that you can get a better view of what I'm doing. So what I'm doing here is I am marking the center of where our pivot holes will be, and I'm going to do these holes at, I believe it was 5/8 of an inch. And the reason for that is I'm going to have a plastic tube that's going to go inside of it to kind of act as a buffer between the leg and the bolt that goes through it, so that the grooves on the bolt don't actually wear into the leg and wear that out prematurely before I want it to. But you may have noticed when I was using the bandsaw to round the ends of the leg that I didn't actually take any material off the end. So I want the leg to be the same length so that I can actually use the end of the leg as a reference for marking these holes. So once we get this finished measuring, what I'm doing is I'm setting up the rest of the headstock so that it can be used as a drill press. And it's got an Allen stock in this chuck, just like anything else that you put on this shaft, whether it's the blade mount or anything like that. So basically, if you have the chuck, then you should have the chuck wrench to tighten and mount things in there just like you would any other drill. But this is a 1/2 inch drill bit that I'm using, and I'm using that same 2x4 that I was using with the bandsaw to test the blade on that. And I'm just doing this to check the depth and make sure that the holes are the right size. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe I actually checked the size of this with a bolt to make sure that it's the right size. The holes that are going to be in the frame and those other supports for the bolts that go through the legs are going to be 1/2 inch, and the only one that's going to be larger are the leg holes. So those leg holes are going to be 5/8 of an inch. So what I'm going to do with this test board is put that 5/8 inch bit in here and make sure that the hole is good. So here I'm just going through and I'm marking all the other 3 legs, and then from there we can switch back out to the 1/2 inch bit so that we can get basically it's a pilot hole. So we're just going to go through that, and then we'll throw the 5/8 in there, and then we'll upsize it, and then we can finish out the legs from there, so that the holes will be the 5/8 inch holes that we want. So I am by no means perfect, and this was illustrated by the realization that, so I had 2 supports or cross boards that were going to go between the legs on the ends, and they were also going to serve as stops. But what I didn't realize was that I would, instead of 2 of them, I would need 4 of them. And the reason for that is because they'll also need 2 on the lower parts of the legs to not only serve to keep the legs the right distance apart and keep those from warping in, but also to house the bracket, so that the board that goes across the legs on the bottom, as you'll see later, will actually have the brackets on the end, so those will need to go attached to those boards. So what I'm doing here is just cutting those end pieces, as well as the 4 other supports that will go with the bolts on the inside of the legs. So I basically have to rip these down to the 3 inches just like the others, and then cut them down to length. So now that we have those cut, it's basically the same process that I used for the legs themselves. It's still going to be the 1.5 inches from the side, and we're going to find that center point, and then these will get 1/2 inch holes through them on one end so that they can be glued to the frame, and then we can use them on the insides of the legs. So since we have the holes in these where we need those, the legs can be sanded. We'll just smooth it out so it's nice and round. That way it'll slide nicely underneath the tabletop. And I just sand through all 4 legs and round this edge. And I believe I'm using either 80 or 100 grit sandpaper. And with the legs sanded, we can prep the tubing. So this is that tubing that I was mentioning earlier that's going to go inside of the leg holes and between the frame and the board that goes on the inside of the leg underneath. So this is 5/8 external diameter, and the inside is approximately 1/2 inch, but it's not quite 1/2 inch. The bolts wouldn't slide into it easily at all. So what I'm doing is I've got the 1/2 inch bit on my drill here, and I'm just boring it out to get it down to the 1/2 inch that I want, so that the bolts will slide easily through it and we can get those mounted together. So then all I'm doing is cutting them to length with this hacksaw. So now that we have everything prepped, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount those boards that I was mentioning earlier that we cut down and we put holes in so that they can mount on the inside of the legs. And in order to do so, I want to make sure everything lines up nicely. So as you can see, I got the leg sitting inside the frame here, and you may be able to tell that that tubing is inside of the leg. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put glue on the end of these boards, and then I'm going to actually put the bolt through this board and through the leg. I don't have holes in the frame yet, but what that's going to do is that's going to allow it to line up with the leg, and it'll keep the leg. And then I'm going to clamp the leg to the frame, and then with another clamp I'm going to pull this board against the end of the frame, so that'll keep the glue nice and set, and it'll also make sure that the right amount of space is between this board and the outside of the frame. So once the glue has dried, what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen and slide that clamp that's on the outside of the frame over, and I got a drill bit on the drill here, and all I'm going to do is pre-drill holes. I'm going to put 2 screws into each of these boards, and that'll provide a little bit more strength for that to support the legs. So there are 3 configurations that I'm using with this drill. The first is the smaller bit for pre-drilling the hole, and then the second I think it's about a 1/2 inch bit to countersink so that the head sits below the surface, and then the third one is your driver bit to drive the screws in. And then once I have that, then I'll remove the clamps and remove the bolt, and then I'll remove the leg also. So that's just to make sure that everything's lined up and that I don't break that glue bond when I'm trying to put the screws in. So that's the basic process. I'm just going through and doing that with all 4 of the leg support boards that we're gluing on and then screwing into the frame. So once we have that done, we can move on to the next part, which is drilling the hole in the outside of the frame. So to do this, I took the tubing out of the leg, and all I'm doing is setting it in place, and I'm basically just using it as a guide to make sure that I'm straight for the most part through all of these holes. And the problem that I ran into is my bit is not quite long enough to make it all the way through. It's about 6 or 7 inches of this board. So, and I wanted it to be nice and straight. So what I do is I ended up adjusting the bit about as far out as I could in the drill, and I got it to where the tip of the bit would actually come through the outside, but not the whole thing. So then from there, what I ended up doing was going from the outside and just hitting that hole, and that would open it up and finish that up for us. So the hardware that I'm going to use to put these legs together is I think it's about a 7-inch bolt, and then I'm going to use a washer on the outside of the frame and on the inside, and then obviously the leg is going to have that piece of tubing inside of it. And then on the inside, I'm going to use a Teflon lock nut, and the reason I decided to do that was so that I didn't have to necessarily have a whole bunch of pressure on on this joint so that that lock nut would stay in place, but I could still have enough free play, if you will, to be able to swing the legs without them being too tight. So here I'm just putting the bolts through with a washer on the outside, as you can see, and putting the insert into the leg, and then pushing the bolt through, and then putting a washer on the inside and that nut, and then I'm just going to tighten that down to where it's snug, not where it's super tight, but just tight enough. So with the legs finished, what I wanted to do was I wanted to reinforce the frame where the outside of the frame is connected to the cross members that go across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 screws into each of those, and even though they're glued, this will reinforce it and give it a little bit more strength. So it's the same process that I used for gluing the boards into the end. I'm going to pre-drill the holes, and then I'm going to do a bit of countersinking. And you can do this with a bit, but I didn't have the bit, so I just used 2 separate ones, and then basically you drive the screws in, and that'll have it reinforced and glued, so it'll be a lot more sturdy and strong. With the legs installed and the frame reinforced, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the legs up, and we're going to put those boards that go across the legs and serve as a stop on. And we're going to do that first. Basically, the only thing that I've found with this is it's kind of a bit of a pain because I clamp it on one side, and if I had another functional clamp that I could actually tighten down, I could do both sides at the same time. But I wanted to use a hand clamp, so I ended up just clamping one side and then pre-drilling one hole, and then countersinking, and then driving a screw into that, and then moving the clamp over to the other side and doing the same process. And then once I have a screw in each side, then I could go through and do the second screw. And the way the legs are, they're 2 boards glued together, so I'm putting 1 screw into each board at a different height on that cross board, so that we don't have create too much weakness in that cross board that's going to serve as a stop. So I had one leg that was it seemed to have a little bit of a bow to it. So what I did was I clamped that down, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put the cross members that go between the bottoms of the legs, and they also have the brackets on those. So all I'm doing is I'm going to start by finding the center point of these 2 cross members, and then we're going to screw our brackets onto those. And then once we have the brackets on, we can flip them over so that the bracket is down, and then we can actually mount these cross boards to the legs themselves. And it'll be the same basic mounting as the other cross boards. So there will be 2 screws in each side, and 1 screw of each side into each board of the legs that we glued together. So now that we have the frame assembled, I wanted to run through and do an operational check of it. And this was really exciting for me because this was more of a proof of concept. It showed me that my design had worked. And so this board that goes across the center, it's basically held in by tension. I don't even have to put screws into the bottom. There's holes in the brackets, so if I wanted to, I could fasten it together, and that would just be a matter of laying on its side and screwing it together. But I'm pushing it and wiggling it here, and it is really nice and solid. So having checked that, I can install the top, and as you can tell, it's got a little bit of warp to it, and screwing it down is the next step, and that should level things out and make that tabletop nice and solid. So all I'm doing here is measuring where the center of the frame underneath the top will be, and I'm just marking where I'm gonna pre-drill my holes and countersink those, and then I can go through and screw down the top and finish everything up. So here is the finished product for the woodworking bench, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. The legs fold up underneath it nicely and make it so it's only about 6 inches in depth, and it's just right where I wanted everything to be. So I couldn't be happier with this, and I appreciate everybody that watched and followed along for the project. Don't forget to check out other projects that I have done and other playlists, and I'm trying to get to the monetization level, I guess you could say, which is 1,000 subscribers and a certain number of hours of watch time. So I'll keep pumping out different projects, and if you would be kind enough to hit that subscribe button and click that bell for notifications so that you get notified of future content, I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time.